Okay, it's 3 o'clock, so we'll get rolling here. I will now call the Land Management Committee of the Diversion Authority to order on this Wednesday, October 30th, 2019. Let's take a roll call.
Borbom?
Here.
Breitling?
Here.
Campbell?
Here.
Grubb?
Here.
Hendrickson?
Here.
Judd? Manju? Olson?
Here.
Peterson? Shorling?
Here.
Strand? Zimmerman?
Welcome, everyone. Sounds like we've got a quorum. You have the agenda in front of you. Any changes to the agenda other than we want to add this land auction item to the other business section? Anything else? An approval of the agenda, please.
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed,
Aye.
same sign. And moving on to the minutes, item number 3. Need someone to approve the minutes, or are there any corrections or additions? So moved. Approval. Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. And we'll move on then to item number 4, property acquisition status report, starting on pages 9 through 17. And Eric.
Yes, thank you. As Commissioner Shirley noted, starting on page 9 is the property acquisition status report for October. Page 10 is the overall map showing the status of all the impacted parcels. I guess as you can see, we've got more green on the north end and continue to make progress. We're over 300 and I guess nearly 330 parcels acquired as of the date of this report. I think we've acquired a few more since then as well. And I know we also have a handful that have signed purchase agreements just in the past week or so since this report was produced. So continuing to make progress, although there's an awful lot of negotiations that are ongoing and we've still got a ways to go. The rest of the report, as usual, shows the status by different areas. And so I don't necessarily have any more details to share with you, but happy to answer questions if you have some. I would just point out we have not yet split out the southern embankment into all of its individual components, nor have we split out the upstream mitigation area by state, but those are things that we will be changing in the coming month to show a little bit of additional delineation for those two categories on page 15 and page 16.
So Eric, I had noticed that in the past, our goal had been to have the channel all buttoned up by next spring 2020, and that has now been pushed back to the fall. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. With some coordination with the P3 team in understanding when they plan to issue the final RFP, hinges on some of the legal matters that are ongoing. That date for the channel lands has slid back to fall of 2020. In particular, we want to have the parcels where there's structures. We want to have those acquired by September 1st of 2020, and on regular land parcels by mid-October of 2020. So that allows a bit more time for negotiations. However, in many cases, the negotiations have reached a point where we're too far apart to continue negotiating, and so we've started formal negotiations. I guess it's just one of the steps in the process. So we've started some formal negotiation on several of these parcels already.
Thank you. Any questions regarding the property status?
I just know last month Commissioner Campbell had asked in regards to the budget and were those concerns reflected in any change?
Yeah, good. Thanks for bringing that up. So that's on page 12. The question was regarding the thermometer chart in terms of the dollars spent. And I think Commissioner Campbell had noted we had only acquired a handful of those easements, yet we had spent $82,000. This $82,000, there's a little asterisk on it this month added, so that includes payments for the monuments as well as easements. So there were, I forget the number, a couple hundred monuments that were placed out on these parcels, and so those monuments were, we paid for those monuments, and then the handful of easements that we've acquired as well, so that adds up to the $82,000. Good memory.
Recollection is over 300.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So, tell me, I've gotten a couple of calls on the environmental mitigation monitoring areas. What's the status of that? Where are you at?
It is number 8 on our agenda. I can certainly
Oh, I'm
address it
sorry,
if you'd
okay.
like.
No, let's wait then.
Okay.
No, it's fine. Perfect, okay, then let's go on to item 5, upstream mitigation area letters, item C.
In your packet here is a copy of letters that were sent out to upstream property owners early this month. There's one letter for North Dakota residents or North Dakota property owners and a second letter for the Minnesota property owners. This was really a follow-up letter that was a follow-up to similar communication shared with upstream property owners back in late February. In the late February letter, we informed these property owners that we were anticipating getting through the Clomer process by the end of summer, and then we would be back in touch with them at that point. We continue to have some ongoing discussions with FEMA and the Clomer process, and I think that's continues to go well, but it's admittedly taken a little longer than we had originally anticipated. So this letter was sort of a follow-up from that February letter, just sharing with property owners what we know, pointing out that we're still continuing to work on that Clomer process. So since this time frame that we sent these letters out, we've had a handful of property owners reach out. I know Joel's had a few phone calls. We've had some meetings with property owners. I think in most situations, those conversations go okay, but there are kind of a growing anxiety out there, and people are tired of being in limbo with the uncertainty that, we don't have these determinations.
And I'll add on to that a little bit, and we talked about this at public outreach just prior to this meeting. These letters are great, and what I would like to do is ensure that we're reaching out to folks at least once a quarter with information. I have been attending a number of board meetings for the Clomar, so each political entity that's affected by our flood insurance rate map changes requires us through FEMA to notify them and engage them about the Clomar process. That's been going very well, and just to reiterate something that Eric had mentioned, is most of what I hear when I go to these boards are, when are we going to get clarity? When are things going to happen? What's going to happen? And in this letter, if you read through it, it spells out fairly clearly that we're waiting on the Clomar process, which we would hope to get some clarity in the next couple months. We also hope to have some clarity from the State Water Commission on the North Dakota side within the next couple months. Unfortunately, the Minnesota side is kind of in limbo with the contested case hearing, so we don't expect any determinations on the Minnesota side. But I think it's still important that we're providing this quarterly information to all affected property owners, so at least they're getting some sort of information from us, even if we can't tell them any definite answers. But the good thing moving forward here is that with the clarity from the State Water Commission and from FEMA, we will be able to start to zero in on what specific mitigation tactics we can present to folks on the North Dakota side. So that'll be a positive thing, a positive message we can get out to the North Dakota affected residents. Unfortunately, it will not coincide with the Minnesota affected residents.
So are we getting any message out to those Minnesota folks that are no longer affected? That seemed to strike me when I've gone to some public meetings. There seems to be some real confusion as to, I mean, there are people that are just simply no longer affected and
Yeah,
still upset.
you're right, Mary, and there's some in the North Dakota side too. So I met with Eagle and Walcott Townships, and both of them were pretty unclear about the changes that happened during Plan B and what was going to happen to some of their residents in their township. Yeah, I think we need to reach out to those folks and just clear the air and let them know that they are no longer going to be impacted by this project, despite the fact that our message was they were prior to the Plan B changes. It's a good point, Mary. We'll take that and we'll that. So
It just always kind of strikes me that, I mean, they hang on to that, and it's unfortunate because the plan has changed significantly, especially in a positive way for Minnesota residents. So, okay, then let's move on to, any questions? Acquisition timeline in North Dakota, 22 to 25.
Another piece of information for you on page 22 is a letter drafted from Joel to the Corps, Terry Williams, and attached to that letter is an updated timeline for the acquisition process in North Dakota. As the letter points out, we had originally identified the process would take around 8 months, and as we've researched this a bit further and coordinated with legal counsel on all of the gory details and processes and steps involved, we've now realized that we needed to provide a bit more time to that schedule before we could sort of guarantee acquisition of the necessary property rights. So we needed to make sure that the Corps was aware of this as they share their design files and right-of-way requirements with our lands team. We need to have enough time so that we can secure those property rights before they need to award their contracts. And so we wanted to share this with the Corps. This was shared with the Corps a couple weeks ago as we were waiting to get the right-of-way files for Southern Embankment Reach 1, otherwise known as the Western Tieback. And then attached to this letter is that 11-month schedule. You can see that there's some steps that are labeled A, B, C, D, and E prior to the actual negotiations with property owners. And those pre-steps include the appraisal process and some boundary survey work. And then once we get the appraisal back, then we start the informal negotiations and then subsequently formal negotiations. And that's all based on the updated quick take laws that North Dakota Century Code includes right now. This is largely an untested process. We have not used this new quick take process since it was passed in 2017, and I hope we don't have to use it. But it does provide a sort of a recipe, I guess, for following these steps. In the steps, there are 4 or 5 times when we need to send formal letters to property owners and get a read receipt from the property owner. Undoubtedly, and Chris McShane is in the audience, he can certainly speak to this probably better than anybody. Undoubtedly, there will be some troubles serving those property owners. You know, they'll be gone, they'll be on vacation, the dog will eat it, or whatever excuse, you know, we can find. And so we've included some time for that service in these steps. We hope it's appropriate time, but you know, those are some of the bogeys that we'll continue to deal with. But nonetheless, we wanted to share that 11-month time frame with the Corps and felt like this committee would be interested in understanding that as well. We've been working towards developing a similar schedule on the Minnesota side. Don't have that ready yet, but I presume that's of interest to the Minnesota group, and so we'll make sure to get that in the works.
What's the previous timeline that we were anticipating?
The letter we had previously sent to the Corps back in 2017 suggested an 8-month time frame.
Okay. So is it the pre-offer steps that is drawing this out, or is it just
There's some additional time scattered throughout here. Some of it is because of that read receipt issue where we've added some time frames, and then there was an extra 30 days that was added in here because of, I guess, our sort of cautious review on the county commission's involvement. Originally, we thought we could sort of parallel track a few of those things, but just to be extraordinarily cautious, we've added an extra 30 days for that. So.
Madam Chair. Just a quick question, it might be easy question, but what's the difference between informal and formal negotiations, and what are the timeframes attached to that?
Yeah, so the statute reads that we are supposed to informally negotiate for no less than 60 days. And then if that's unsuccessful, then we send the property owner the formal appraisal and a formal offer to purchase their property based on the appraised amount. In practice, we're using the appraisal to start the informal negotiations, but in theory, I suppose you could start informally negotiating based on, you know, a bar napkin or some other sort of informal process. And so in our process, it's probably really not a whole lot different, but the statute reads informally negotiate for 60 days, no indication that we need to have an actual appraisal at that point, and then once you've crossed 60 days, start a formal negotiation based on an appraisal. Again, we're starting the appraisal process early because we think it's probably the right step to do. So.
Yep. The Minnesota side will be different than that, and we've asked for those timelines too, Chuck. So hopefully they'll be providing that process to us at our MCC JPA meeting. I don't know if we'll have it by tomorrow, but by next month probably we'll have something.
That's quicker, correct?
Yes, it's a totally different process.
Does that go through your county commission as well?
No.
Well, yes and no. On the Minnesota side, the MIC board or the MCC JPA will do the sort of informal negotiations, and in the event we can't reach mutual agreement, then we'll have to.
Yeah, there is no legislative requirement to that. All those acquisitions have to be approved by the county board in Minnesota as compared to, you know, what you have to do in Cass County. That's what I was referring to. It's a totally different process. Depending on where if you get to the eminent domain issue, depending on where the location of that property is, then it might take action by the county board versus the city of Moorhead.
Any questions?
I
Comments?
guess the only thing I would just add is we really don't intend to use Quick Take, and we hope we don't have to. I think the proof is in the pudding of the 330 some parcels we've acquired. We've used Quick Take 5 times, and only one of those has actually gone the whole process. So I think that's sort of proof speaks for itself. That being said, the only way for us to sort of guarantee a timeline is to have this process in place, and so that's why we're spending some time making sure we understand the steps in the process.
Yeah, and I'll also add on, just to make a point there too, Eric, the critical component of this is that we keep the Corps of Engineers on track with their project schedules. And so we'll be talking about Southern Embankment Reach number 1 next. It's imperative that, you know, we have 11 months before they're planning on bidding so that all the property is acquired. So unfortunately, as we get into that 11th month period, we need to start following these quick take steps so that we can ensure that all the property is acquired by that time period. I don't think our intent is to start this process in areas where we have more than 11 months before we absolutely need the property. But this is the process that we'll have to implement if it gets down to not having all of that property and being in jeopardy of that 11-month window before the Corps bids out their projects.
Sure. Okay, well then, let's go ahead and talk about Southern Embankment Reach 1.
Yeah, and we've shared with you that we were anxiously awaiting the real estate drawings from the core for Southern Embankment Reach 1, otherwise known as the Western Tieback. We did in fact receive those files from the core. The letter is actually dated October 16th. For some reason, the version in the packet, I must have screwed up. There's normally a heading on here, but this letter we did receive October 16th. It's a cover letter to the final real estate drawings for Southern Embankment Reach 1. You'll notice in the second paragraph, the Corps requested those property rights by July 1st of 2020. And obviously, they'd like them as soon as possible so that there's no confusion about having the property rights, so they can go ahead and not only bid, but award their construction contract. We just received those in October. Add 11 months to that, you'll notice pretty quickly that July is going to be a pretty tough date to commit to. And so the next page, on page 28, is our response letter, which basically indicates that you know, we are working on this immediately. We had all the appraisers and everything under contract, and so we I think had all of our ducks in a row. But that being said, we wanted to remind the Corps that our process could take up to 11 months. And so we're going to work diligently to meet their July 1 timeframe, but we anticipate that some of the acquisitions might take until mid-September of 2020. Fortunately, that's still before their date when they need to award that construction contract. They would need to award that by the end of September of 2020. And so there's very little wiggle room in the schedule, and I think the Corps is aware of that, and Joel and Bob and Nathan, the technical people, are aware of that. Again, wanted this group to be aware that this is probably going to be one of those situations where we're going to have to follow the recipe pretty closely. And we know there's a few property owners out here who are unfortunately opposed to the project and likely be opposed to the acquisition process.
So is that alignment, the alignment for the tieback, is that certain now?
Yes.
It is, yeah. We have all the right-of-way drawings from the Corps, and we've now initiated the lands group to start the process to ensure that we acquire all those lands by September of next year. We need to bid that project in 2020 because the project workload for the Corps in 2021 is so high that we need to be able to expend those federal dollars in 2020. So,
Was that able to do that little zigzag thing there to?
yeah, we did follow. It was agreed upon, and we were able to follow the township roads instead of cutting kittywampus across the fields. And so, I think that makes it a little bit more palatable for area landowners. But obviously, there's still some opposition to it. So.
Are there other opportunities along the channel that still could be moved a little, or is it pretty much that's the channel's all done?
The channel's solidified. Western Tieback is solidified. The Corps is working on their preliminary design for the rest of the Southern Embankment. They're scheduled to have that done, I believe it's next year, middle of next year. I forget the exact time frame, but so there's been a few, tweaks here and there. Most of them are pretty unsubstantial, although I know, it's important to the property owners, but in any great magnitude, I don't know that there's any real major changes from what you've seen.
What about on the Minnesota side? Is that?
Well, you'll see on here that there's, I'm just looking at this map that the MetroCog guys handed out. There's a little bump out around the CW Valley Co-op. There's some ongoing discussions with the Corps about the bump out around that facility. And then the east-west portion in Minnesota, I believe everybody's committed to moving that to the county line, so it's on the road rather than north of the road. And so those changes are going to be captured in the preliminary engineering report. And Bob's shaking his head, so I'm not too far out of line here.
Chair?
Yes.
I have a question as I'm sitting here. I apologize for not asking earlier. And on the acquisition report where you have the blue in negotiation, what qualifies it to be in negotiation? Does that mean that someone has reached out to you, or does that mean we've sent letters?
In this report, it means that the appraisal has been done, and we've submitted an offer to that property owner, and our land agent is out meeting with them.
So there has been owner contact.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? It's a lot of really good information, but you no doubt might want some more information. Okay, then let's talk about the environmental monitoring easements. And I had asked about that earlier,
Yeah.
and you're probably going to answer my question.
Sure, well, I hope so.
Page 31.
Yeah, I guess starting on page 29 is the cover letter. I guess maybe just to set the stage a little bit. There's 420 parcels that are impacted by the environmental monitoring easements. Those parcels are scattered all across the region here. All of the parcels have a waterway, and the Corps wants to measure and survey the biotic and geomorphic conditions along those waterways. And so that's measuring the bugs, measuring the fish, measuring erosion, trying to determine, does the project change those conditions? And in order for them to make those determinations, they need to have a baseline before the project is constructed, monitoring during construction, and then monitoring several rounds after construction. Some of that monitoring started back in 2012. There was additional monitoring in 17 and 18, and we used a right of entry process to do those initial rounds of monitoring. That initial round of monitoring helped the Corps identify exactly where they needed the easements. And so they supplied to us back in the spring a formal request to obtain easements on those sites. We got to work in reviewing those easement requests, and there was, I guess, what we called haircutting, basically where the easement request just clipped a small portion of a parcel, and we said, well, can we just haircut this parcel out? So we went through several rounds of these haircuttings and then started, developing the easement document, getting surveyors out there to define the boundaries of those easements, develop the legal descriptions, send those easements out to property owners, and start negotiating on the easements themselves. A pretty big process that, again, they had requested we obtain all of those by next spring so that the Corps could then do their monitoring in 2020. So we've been working away at that pretty diligently and had a number of neighborhood meetings, sent sort of batches of these easement requests out by watershed, and we're having some success. However, it's also a pretty big lift, and so recently the Corps requested that we develop an action plan for how are we actually going to secure all of these easements for their monitoring in 2020. They wanted to know what our time frame was so that they could understand how they are going to contract with their teams for doing the actual field work. And so this letter, the cover letter, basically just explains a bit of background, and it references the action plan that starts on page 31. The first handful of pages are regarding North Dakota, and then the last pages 34 and 35 are regarding the Minnesota process. On the North Dakota side, our process is that we're going to continue to pursue these voluntary acquisition of these easements. In the event that we are unsuccessful with some or many of obtaining those easements, we've suggested on the top of page 33 that we would start another round of right of entries. The right of entry process has been successful in the past. There's some risk that if we try to do this additional round of surveying with another right of entry, the courts might come back and say, you've crossed the line, this is more of a taking, and you can't continue to come back for right of entry after right of entry after right of entry. So Chris in the audience here can certainly speak to the risks of that, but that being said, if we are unsuccessful getting the voluntary easements signed, it seems like a right of entry process has been successful in the past, and so our recommendation and our action plan was to If we don't have the easement signed by mid-December, then we will start trying to pursue rights of entries for the round of monitoring in 2020, and hopefully secure those rights of entries to allow that monitoring to occur. Subsequent to all that, then we would start the process of doing an actual appraisal, trying to demonstrate the value. We've concluded that the value of these easements is less than the county's minimum of $750, and so we've been offering $750 to all of the property owners where we need an easement. And in the event we need to hire an appraiser, we're hoping that the appraiser would validate that those easement amounts are in fact less than $750, willing to support Chris through a forced acquisition process if need be. On the Minnesota side, our plan tomorrow at the MCCJPA board is to ask the board to approve a resolution basically authorizing our land agents to reach out to the property owners and ask those property owners for a right of entry to do the initial round of monitoring in Minnesota. There has not been monitoring yet in Minnesota, and so we're, I guess, from a state perspective, the North Dakota side is maybe a little bit further along. And so the right of entry process, we feel, should work well in Minnesota, and hopefully the land agents are successful in securing those rights of entries through a voluntary process. So that's a lot to throw at you. I wanted you to have this information, but I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Since this has been going out, this is one of the ones I've been getting questions about, and it seems to alarm landowners more than I think it needs to. And once you explain what we're really gonna do, it's like, oh, fine. But, so I don't know if our letter is just too big brotherish, or, is there an option to let people know that, well, first of all, that most of this is gonna be via river entry rather than driving up on property owners' land. I just wonder if there's a better way to clarify this, because I think it seems to spook people.
Yeah, so we've had 4 or 5 neighborhood meetings with, sort of targeted groups by watershed and by site. And there's been a common theme from the property owners and feedback, 2 primary issues that they've raised as concerns that we're working to address. One of them is the easement we've been requesting is a perpetual easement, permanent, much like you have an easement along the road that goes in front of your property. That's a perpetual easement. But yet the frequency of this monitoring is a bit uncertain. On average, the Corps and their teams are telling us it's maybe once every 5 years. And I guess sort of gut check tells us that maybe after 30, 40 years, maybe the conclusion is we won't need to continue monitoring at all. And so some of the feedback, and we don't know that, but there's some of the feedback from the property owners is, do you really need a perpetual easement forever? And they're concerned about how that might impact the resale of their land, or if they turn it over to their heirs, or those types of things. And so they've asked, can you put a date certain in the easement? Just last week, we worked, and we're continuing to get some feedback from the Corps on that, but we've worked with the Cass County Joint Board and proposed putting a 50-year time frame on this. We thought 20 to 30 years is maybe a bit too short, 70 years is too long, 50 years maybe that's the Goldilocks version, and it's just right. So that was one primary feedback piece we got. Secondly, there's been questions about what happens if somebody is on my property doing the surveying and they break their ankle, or they get attacked by a bear, or who knows what get shot by a deer hunter or whatever. I don't want to be liable for somebody on doing survey work. And so we're working to include some language in the easement that guarantees that whoever is on site will be insured. The Diversion Authority will ultimately take over the responsibility for doing these surveys and will likely hire some contractors to do that. Pretty standard practice for the Diversion Authority's contractors to have insurance. The Corps' contractors also have insurance. And so really it's kind of a simple solution, although the Corps' legal team wanted to review that provision, and so we're waiting for some feedback. But those were the two primary concerns we heard from property owners, and again, we're working to address those. A few other things that, you know, lesser concerned, I guess, but we're working to incorporate all of that property owner feedback. So.
Is there any requirement for notification to the landowner?
Yeah, all of these easements require notification to the property owner before somebody goes on their land. I think one of the struggles we have from a legal standpoint is I believe the language says we will use our best attempt to contact the property owner before access is made. You know, and today, email's becoming probably more common than regular mail. 30, 40 years from now, who knows what the method of contact is going to be. And so from an easement standpoint, if this is permanent or even if it's 50 years, there's some hesitancy to delineate exactly how that contact is made. But yes, there is provisions to contact property owners.
Questions or comments? Yes, Jenny.
As a landowner, I think I would have that knee-jarring reaction if I got a letter. I mean, whether you know what a plan is or not, if you get that letter, I think that's human nature. I will say that adding a clause in there in terms of years seems to be a possible good option. I know that we don't at the county issue permits for businesses or projects forever, so that may help to ease people's uneasiness, I guess.
I also joked that I've been working on this project for 8 years, and in 50 years, I sure hope I'm not working on it anymore, so sounds great to me. But.
And I think, you know, I think that brings up a great point about receiving the letter. And Mary, getting back to your original question, I think a lot of the folks that are receiving these letters didn't think they were going to be impacted by the diversion whatsoever, because a lot of these environmental and geomorphological sites are outside of the impacted area of the floodplain. So I think there's a little bit of, well, what is this, and where did it come from, and why my property? You know, unfortunately, the Corps came up with their plan to monitor biological and geomorphology. And so that plan wasn't necessarily available where all these sites were going to be, you know, ahead of time. But I think the message I've been trying to portray is that this is actually a positive thing for the landowners, because that monitoring is going to allow us to ensure that unintended circumstances or things associated with our project are uncovered, and that we can mitigate those in the future. And so without having these monitoring sites, it's going to be very hard to address future issues and not determine that they're just natural causes that are causing stream bank erosion or you know, the demise of a species in the area. So it really is important so that we can make sure that in the future we can address impacts that maybe are not intended or that are unknown at this time.
Is there language in there that it would cease if it was no longer needed? I don't know under what circumstances it would no longer be needed, but I mean, like 50 years from now, who knows what technology might be out there that would change things.
Yeah, I don't believe there's any, I mean, I suppose there's some legal action that we could take to remove the easement from a property, but I don't believe there's any language in the current easement that, you know, that says that's an option. The intention is to have a permanent easement, essentially. And I guess just one other thing to point out, you know, that while the Corps was the lead agency in determining this environmental monitoring program, they've done it in collaboration with all sorts of other agencies, all as part of an adaptive management plan that is compliant with NEPA. And so there's been quite a bit of coordination over over the years, and I guess I haven't been deeply involved in that. I don't know, Nathan or Bob probably have been more than anybody. But it's been, well developed. I think there's probably been some commitments and agreements made amongst the agency teams to help develop the plan and, make sure it does provide that mechanism for monitoring erosion or other things and have that hook if we find that there is some impacts.
Well, let's move right along. We've got Roger on the phone. Item number 10, your joint water resource district update. Or unless somebody else was going to give it. Is Roger still online?
This is a standing agenda item, I guess.
Hey, Mary, I am still on the line. Would it be possible for Eric to give a little update?
Certainly.
I would appreciate that. Thanks.
Yep.
Just a standing agenda item, I guess, here for any updates that might be warranted. I guess the joint board continues to meet twice a month, moving into November and December. I think they just have one meeting scheduled. We may be asking them for a special meeting if need be. Each meeting, we've probably got, 100 pages of material for them to pour through, whether that's appraisal reviews or purchase agreements, various matters working to acquire the land rights for the project. And so lots of activity happening there. I think the joint board stays pretty busy, and their rear ends are getting sore from having 2 or 3 hour meetings. But so thank them for their hard work on that. I would point out that maybe just to capture number 9 on the agenda here as well, we've asked the joint board to approve a number of parcels to transition from the informal negotiations into the formal negotiations. I think we have probably close to 50 of those parcels that have crossed that threshold now. And so those property owners will be getting the formal letter. And again, that's just sort of part of the recipe and, working through the process on that. But for everybody's awareness, I suppose you could say the heat is maybe getting turned up on a few of those. And again, that's part of the job we need to get done. So.
And those are all in the channel?
Yes.
Okay.
The channel, or there's a couple parcels on the wild rice control structure that are in that category as well.
Any questions for Eric on any of the updates and also on the formal negotiations? Okay, thank you all for your hard work on all that. I know it's quite a heavy lift. Then next we have a new agenda item, or wait, I'll back up. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Minnesota Joint Power Agreement update, please.
We meet tomorrow, so I
Oh,
don't have anything to report today.
all right. Well, we'll look forward to hearing from you. Then I would invite MetroCog to please join us.
Maybe just a bit of a setup here. I understand MetroCog was at the county commission's meeting and asked if they had an opportunity to, have some more regular engagement with the diversion authority. And I guess given the recreation plan is ongoing and there's a lands component to that, we thought this maybe was as good a venue as any. So.
Alrighty. Well, thank you for having me here today. My name is Adam Alterberg with the Metropolitan Council of Governments. Just like to provide a brief update of the recreation plan component we're assisting with in collaboration with the Diversion Authority and various stakeholders throughout the community. As a quick refresher, this is a project that we kicked off last June in association with SRF Consulting Group and serves under the guidance of a study review committee made up of planning, engineering, and park district staff from Fargo, West Fargo, Horace, and Cass County. We spent much of August and September building public awareness of this plan through meetings with most every jurisdiction and park board in the area, as well as holding several pop-up meetings at different community events. And we also did develop an online survey to solicit public input, potential recreation and non-recreational amenities people would like to see. Earlier in October, we held a 2-day workshop, which included site visits by the Study Review Committee to key locations along the diversion corridor. as well as we held 6 different focus group meetings with different community partners, as well as had our first official public input meeting at the Rusted Recreation Center in West Fargo. It was during this time that, through discussions with the executive director and others, that we realized that there was a need to expedite the timeline for this project, and that with the understanding that the P3 contractor would be responsible for all maintenance and activities within the diversion footprint and selected adjacent parcels, that recreation and non-recreational amenities may now come in the form of one or potentially several alternate bids. So that's shifted our focus towards trying to nail down what we can or should incorporate as different amenities with this project. So with that, I'd like to share just briefly some of the concepts that we've begun to develop, which look at both summer and winter recreational amenities. And these are in the handouts that we also passed out earlier. I'll stress that these are still very much in draft form. But they at least begin to lay a foundation, as well as incorporate some of the comments we've heard from the public and other stakeholders. And you can see that the items in green are the amenities that we're currently considering under the P3 procurement process. So the first image here is the summer trails map. Notes a number of amenities, including a continuous paved multi-use trail, as well as an art walk and equestrian trail on the right bank, EMB. We also include single track and ATV trails on the left bank, EMB. In addition, we've identified kind of a small potential wetland walk in the mitigation area that's upstream. Towards the urban area near West Fargo and Horace, some of the additional amenities we have identified include an amphitheater area that could be used for festivals or a seasonal farmers market, sledding hill with a warming house and equipment rental, dog park, and then also potential areas for urban ag or community gardens. Towards Node 1, we see this kind of as a prime location for camping and some other outdoor amenities that are currently lacking within our metro area. I guess one last thing I'll call out here too is on Node 3, we have begun to discuss the possibility of incorporating some sort of small interpretive center, as well as using potentially remnant parcels for small scale farming or farmer training opportunities. And also between near nodes 2 and 3, we've also started to talk about the idea of incorporating solar farms and combining with pollinator habitats that could benefit certain crop yields in adjacent fields. The winter trails map, a little bit more simple, but does call it snowmobile trails near Harwood and Argusville. These were amenities that were important to the people when we spoke to those communities up there. We've also called out cross-country ski trails and snowshoe trails, both kind of near the urbanized area, again, by West Fargo, and also, again, towards Node 1, as well as a possible ice skating trail on the Cheyenne Diversion. And then lastly, this last graphic just shows locations of grade separations along the corridor, and then specifying bicycle pedestrian amenities along the county road bridges that would be going over the channel, as well as where trails may need to go under the interstates. So with that, I'll again reiterate these are still very much in draft form. There's a number of details that still need to be worked out, but with that, be happy to help with any comments or questions you may have at this time.
Great, thank you, Adam. This is very exciting. Fun to have something fun to talk about. Questions for anyone? And what are your next steps then?
Next steps, we have a meeting tomorrow actually. Joel, and then members with Jacobs Engineering, and then members from SRF and MetroCog to kind of talk about how some of these amenities may be incorporated into spec language. And then after that, we do have another study review committee meeting in about 2 weeks' time. So.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate your presence here.
Thanks.
Then, under other business, I wanted to talk about land auctions and the appropriateness of using land auctions in acquiring property for easements. And Joel, are you going to take that away for us?
Sorry, I'll start and Eric can jump into to maybe focus on some of the specifics. But in front of you folks, we've handed out this land auction that's occurring by the Hixenbach Oxbow subdivisions. It's approximately 827 acres for all total 10 parcels. 7 of those parcels on the back side of that sheet that I've handed out are going to be parcels that will require a flowage easement as part of our upstream impacts. And so these, I think it's about maybe 700 and so odd acres that would need to be, the property rights for the flowage easements would need to be acquired. Also on that map, T4, 5, and 6 would require construction easements for the I-29 grade raise associated with the diversion project. So with these parcels coming up for auction, the internal discussion was, well, should we bid on these? And with the intent of putting the flowage easements on and then turning around and divesting the properties as quick as possible. But the problem is we have no policy for this. And we received concern from area farmers that they would have to bid against the government, basically, for these properties. And so I kind of raised this as a red flag issue that we need to bring to committee level here and ultimately to the board level so that you folks can provide us with some direction on how we proceed when we have property auction, public auction for property where we need to acquire land rights. Now, we have engaged in auctions before. The difference on those properties is those were properties that were needed for project-specific elements to be constructed. So long-term, they would not continue in agricultural production. They would be a part of the diversion project. This is much different because these parcels will continue in agricultural production in perpetuity. And so the idea here is it our place to be meddling in public auctions? So, knowing that we need to acquire some property rights, but also knowing that we're going to approach acquiring those property rights regardless of if these properties are up for auction or not. So I'll let Eric provide any other specifics if you wish, Eric. And I'd like to maybe just open it up for comment. And what we're really looking for here is the policy creation and to provide some certainty to the producers upstream that we are going to bid on these or we aren't going to bid on these.
And I think it's also important to keep in mind that, as we get to the DA board, we are safeguarding we're looking out for the public's dollar, and at the same time, we want to make sure that people are being treated fairly. So we've got a couple of farmers here today, and I would love to hear their opinion on this, but there are definitely some benefits to doing this as well. And one of the big question marks out there that has been brought up many times is what is this lease, what is this flowage easement worth? And there are some things that doing this could help with, but it's very, very sensitive. So I think that it's important that we have come together on a policy on this, and then, policies can change down the road, but for right now, we need some direction, so.
And
Eric.
Before Eric begins, I want to note this issue to me transcends this committee. It also touches on the public outreach committee. And so I did bring this up during public outreach. And there were a few members of the public outreach that felt pretty strongly that this is not something that we should be meddling in. But ultimately, the committee deferred the discussion to the Land Management Committee for more direction, so.
I would just add two things. First off, I would agree that we don't have a direct policy about buying land from an auction. But in our mitigation plan, we do have a policy about buying land from willing sellers via sort of early acquisitions. And the policy basically goes on to say that if there's a willing seller that approaches us, we would be a willing buyer. And so is that exactly what's happening here? Not really, but kind of, sort of. You know, this family has, I guess the patriarch passed away recently. We did have a meeting with the auctioneer just to get a little bit more info about, you know, their situation, as well as sharing with them some information about the property rights that the project will need, including the flowage easements and the temporary construction easement. And so through those conversations, I think the auctioneer really appreciated getting some information so that, you know, he can make sure all of the interested buyers are well aware of you know, those issues. And we learned that, you know, they felt as a family that the best way for them to get the most return on their land was to put it up for auction. There's something like over 20 heirs to these properties right now, and so you can imagine if they have 800 acres of land, trying to figure out who gets which part and, you know, who decides on the price, and so the auction is the best way for them to do that. And so in some regards, it's very much a market indication of land, you know, land values, and, you know, at a minimum, we're going to be monitoring this very closely. We've had multiple discussions about should we or shouldn't we be an interested buyer, and I think, as Joel said, we're sort of looking for feedback from the group. I think there's, you know, probably pros and cons either way. So.
Thank you. So that being said, I'm looking for some feedback. I know, Roger, you're on the line. Would you like to share?
Yes, Mary, I'd like to share some comments. I've thought about this on both sides of it, and I'm against us going to this auction to purchase land to put a flowage easement on it.
Did we lose you, Roger? We can't hear you now.
Maybe while Roger's waiting, I know we did have a discussion with the Cass County Joint Board about this as well, and Roger shared his thoughts at that meeting. I think, not to put words in his mouth, but I think he's concerned about the sort of government project competing with, you know, private property owners. One suggestion that was made is if we would end up, you know, being interested in this, and if we would end